The concept of ownership is central to determining the time at which financial assets and liabilities come into being or are recognized. There are two types of ownership: legal ownership and economic ownership, sometimes also referred to as beneficial ownership. The legal owner of assets and liabilities is the institutional unit entitled by law and sustainable under the law to claim title to the instrument. Ownership of financial assets and liabilities arises from the contractual provisions of the instrument, which determine the time at which assets and liabilities should be recognized and derecognized. Consider the example of an individual who has borrowed money from a bank. The bank has a legal claim to the loan, which is a financial asset. The individual is legally responsible for the liability arising from that financial asset, and thus is the owner of the liability or the obligation to repay the loan. Every asset and liability has a legal and an economic owner. In most cases, the legal and economic owner are the same. When they're not, the legal owner has passed on to the economic owner the risk involved in using the resource in an economic activity, as well as the associated benefits. To understand the concept of economic ownership, let's consider the example of an individual who leases an automobile. In an automobile lease, the individual typically has full use of the vehicle and is responsible for all maintenance and other costs associated with the ownership of the vehicle. In exchange, the individual typically makes agreed monthly payments to the owner of the vehicle, the lessor. Thus, for the term of the lease, the individual has economic ownership of the vehicle, even though legal ownership of the vehicle remains with the lessor. Financial assets and liabilities come into being when a commitment is made by one unit to make a payment to another unit. This means that an entity recognizes financial assets and liabilities in its financial statements when the entity becomes party to the contractual provisions of the instruments. Financial assets and liabilities cease to exist when there is no longer a commitment for one unit to make payments to the other. This means that financial assets and liabilities are removed or derecognized from financial statements at the time when the obligations specified in the contract are discharged, canceled, or expired.